You've opposed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you were president, how would you have responded to the attacks of September 11th, 2001? That's one question. And another questioner notes that you are a big advocate of cutting defense spending, yet this person also believes you're a supporter of the F-35 program, which has come under a lot of criticism as being wasteful. So how do you reconcile that? So F-35 and September 11th.
Right. First of all, I voted for the war in Afghanistan. Whether history will recall that as the right vote or not, I don't know, but I did. And the reason I did is obviously we knew, or at least had a pretty good idea, who led the attack on 9/11, Osama bin Laden. He was being harbored in Afghanistan. They refused to give him up, and I supported our troops going in there. I did not know then that that war would go on and on and on. That I didn't know. I strongly opposed the war in Iraq, and I think history will record that as the right vote. Now, how you deal with ISIS is a difficult issue. None of these issues are simple, and anyone who jumps up and thinks they have the magical solution is usually very, very wrong. But this is what my fear is. We have been in war in Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade. The cost of that war in human life and suffering and financially has been very, very heavy. I strongly, strongly fear that some of my colleagues are hell-bent in getting us involved in never-ending wars in the quagmire of the Middle East. And I will do my best to oppose that. Now, right now, what you have is a situation where, as an example, Saudi Arabia, some of you may know, is a country controlled by a multi-billion-dollar family, one of the wealthiest families in the world. Turns out that Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest military budget in the world. They have a large military budget. Now, why in God's name is the United States contemplating sending combat troops into Iraq again when you got the Saudis sitting there watching us do that? I think what you have now in the Middle East is, in fact, a war for the soul of Islam. What will Islam be? Will it be the peaceful religion that many believe it to be, or will it be an ISIS form? And I think it is absolutely incumbent for Saudi Arabia, for Qatar, for Kuwait, for Jordan, for the countries in that region to get actively involved in that effort against ISIS. I think the United States and Western Europe should be supportive of their effort. But I do not believe that the United States should lead that effort.
I mean, let me throw out the simplest of questions, which what you're really asking. What makes human people happy? What makes us as human beings happy and content? What is a satisfied life? Now, that's a question we should be asking ourselves.
Right.
Ultimately, it's an interesting, in a country like Denmark, where they provide health care to all of their people, where they provide educational opportunity for free, strong child care, much more economic security in their public policy than we have. To the degree that you can measure it, they are a happier society than we are.
Right.
Because we have so much anxiety. We got to keep striving and striving and striving, and there's not that safety net that we need. So you've raised a very fundamental issue, and that will be day 2 of the Sanders.
But of course, Denmark, thank you very much for your question. Come on forward. But of course, Denmark is not an economic power. Denmark is not a military power. Denmark is not the leader of the free world, as America has been. That's our brand. We've embraced it. Would you be willing to trade that status to have a country that was a little bit more chill?
I mean, you raised that question a little while ago when you said, you asked me, how do we fund, which is expensive, free tuition in public colleges and universities? It is expensive, yes. But then we have to take a hard look at other issues like military spending.
The balance might have to shift.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sir.
I had a question in regards to Obama's new proposed authorization for use of military force, and in regards to the war on terror in general. Do our drone strikes in other countries cause more problems than they solve?
Well, I'm against, let me answer the first part of your question, against, if the president's proposal came to the floor of the Senate, I would vote against it.
You think it would pass? Your no vote notwithstanding, would it pass?
I don't know. It would be probably a close vote. And it's, The problem is the language is too open-ended, and it allows for us to be there for much too long. And the second part of your question was?
Are drone strikes cause more problems than they solve?
Sometimes they do.
Isn't our war on terror essentially fueling itself?
That has been the case in some instances. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. This ISIS and these other terrorist groups mean us harm, and we've got to figure out a way to defeat them. But if a drone attack on an innocent village kills a dozen men and women, does that help us bring those people into association with us? It does not.
Substantively, isn't the policy of ISIS and positions similar to that of our ally Saudi Arabia?
No. I mean, I'm not, as I just mentioned, Saudi Arabia is a country which is authoritarian, which is oligarchic.
But you're not equating the two.
Well, I think he may have.
But you're not equating the two. No. So Bernie Sanders is president, whatever party you get elected under. And ISIS puts out a video in which Jim Foley or some other journalist, or some non-journalist for that matter, has been beheaded. Is the response of our country to the beheading of one of our citizens to do nothing?
No, and I don't think the president is doing nothing.
But would you do nothing?
No, of course not. And it's not a question of the beheading of one person. What ISIS is doing wherever they have conquered it's unspeakable. I mean, literally is unspeakable. It's barbaric. They have got to be defeated. But if the question of American foreign policy is it our ground troops in combat now leading the fight, or is it the Muslim countries? You got billionaire countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, you have the UAE, you have Jordan there. They have got to lead the effort with our support. But ISIS remains a very serious problem, and I want to see them defeated.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
If there was a Sanders doctrine with regard to American foreign policy, what would it be?
Look, the world is a crazy place today. It is a dangerous place. It is a very complicated place. And I think it's impossible for me to give you a 30-second answer of what we do. But this is what I do think. I voted against the war in Iraq. I think history will record that as the right vote. And what we have got to understand is that when you go to war, very often you have unintended consequences. You heard, I heard, people like Vice President Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, President Bush saying, hey, we're going to go in, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, our troops will be back 6 months later, we'll establish democracy in the Middle East. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. But many of us understood that in the real world that was not going to happen. There were unintended consequences. We are suffering those unintended consequences today. So I think, number one, we have got to understand that war has these consequences. Be very, very, very careful before you commit our troops into harm's way. Number two, you can't do it alone. You need an international coalition. The United States, I do not want to see the United States in perpetual warfare in the Middle East. We've got to work with the world. We've got to take on ISIS. But the countries in the region themselves, the Muslim countries, have got to lead that effort with our support.
Please talk about concrete initiatives you have in mind for Western Hemisphere, in particular for Latin America. What are the big trends you see, and what do you have in mind?
Well, as I mentioned to Javier, I voted against NAFTA for a number of reasons. But by the way, in my view, if you look at the impact that NAFTA has had on Mexico, one of the impacts that it has had that we have got to own up to is massive dislocation of small farms in Mexico and driving a lot of workers off of those farms into the cities and into very bad situations. Second of all, I will tell you that I am concerned when I see how aggressive China has been in moving all over the world. Obviously, Latin America is our neighbor, and I am not impressed to the degree that we have been reaching out with Latin America. I support very strongly the President's initiative in normalizing relations with Cuba. I think that's a step forward. But I think that to a too significant degree, we have ignored those people who are closest to us. And I think we've got to work with them in intelligent ways to improve their economies. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that what we have seen in Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, the kind of violence and mob rule there, resulting in kids having to flee, that is something that the United States has to pay attention to. Lastly, broadly speaking, on foreign policy. I voted against the war in Iraq. I think history will record that as the right vote. And if you read some of my speeches at that point, much of what I feared would happen, in fact, did happen in terms of the destabilization of that region.
What I heard last night was I heard a debate on who's going to get us into war the fastest. I didn't hear anything about middle-class income. I didn't hear anything about student loan debt. I didn't hear anything about infrastructure, all the things you said. These people were just there to tout the drums of war to see who can satisfy the military corporate complex.
Well, I think Corky makes a very, very important point. You know, Tom and Corky, it amazes me very much how little some of my Republican colleagues have learned from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think as many of the listeners who at least have some short-term memory can recall what President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, the whole crew of these people were telling us, hey, a war in Iraq, not a problem. We'll go in there. We'll get rid of Saddam Hussein. We'll establish a democracy. Our troops will come home with minimal loss. We'll move to democracy throughout the Middle East. Well, it didn't quite happen like that. And I think Corky's point is very right on, very well spoken. And that is, it seems to me, that these guys who are so quick to attack the president's effort to negotiate an agreement with Iran to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, well, it's not a perfect agreement. Well, I'm sure it's not. And what's their alternative? Is it another war? Is it perpetual war in the Middle East? So I think Corky picked up on a very important point, is how quick these guys are to push aside, to dismiss serious efforts trying to negotiate an agreement rather than go to war. War should be the very, very, very last option. We should exhaust all other approaches before we go to war, but that did not seem to be the case with the Republican candidates.
It sounds like you still have regrets about your Iraq war vote. I wonder if that creates an opening for Senator Sanders and others to question your foreign policy decisions.
Well, that's up to people to decide. I've said that I was wrong, and I certainly am willing to not only admit that, but to point out that I think working with the Obama administration, we did exercise the kind of smart power that I think needs to be the hallmark of our security policy. So I think I am very well prepared and very grounded in what will work in dealing in a very complicated world. This is a multi-polar, challenging world that we have to get right on so many different fronts, and I think I bring a level of understanding and experience to the race that would do me well in the White House.
Your experience in regard to the Secretary being the Secretary of State has been invaluable. I'd like to know where you think our biggest threat is, and especially in the Middle East, and what your thoughts are on the Iran treaty.
Great question. Let me deal with Iran, and then I can go to other threats. I support the agreement that the president has put forth, and I feel strongly about it. As Secretary of State, I negotiated the sanctions that gave us the leverage to begin the preliminary discussions because we imposed enough economic pressure on Iran. And I believe that this agreement will, if vigorously enforced, which I would certainly do as president, would put the lid on Iran's nuclear weapons program for a number of years and would give us more flexibility in dealing with the other threats that Iran presents. So I will be, first in line to say that it's not a perfect agreement, but those are hard to come by, here on this earth anyway. And so therefore, we have to look at what the alternatives are, and by any standard, it is far better than any of the alternatives, either walking away, losing the pressure we put into place through the sanctions, and basically allowing Iran to pursue a nuclear weapons program. Having said that, Iran's other behavior continues to pose a threat in the Middle East, destabilizing governments, threatening Israel, exporting terrorism. And therefore, I think we do have to put together a similar coalition to try to rein in Iran's other actions that are destabilizing and dangerous. I believe I can do that because it was not easy when the president asked me to be Secretary of State, and he and I first started talking about all the threats we faced. We inherited the following. It was under George W. Bush that the Iranians mastered the nuclear fuel cycle. It was under George W. Bush that the Iranians built covert facilities. It was under George W. Bush that they stocked those facilities with centrifuges and got them spinning. So when we began to work on this, the president and I looked at each other and said, American sanctions alone are never going to bring Iran to the negotiating table. We've tried that. I voted for every sanction I could when I was a senator from New York. So that's when, I began to travel extensively, meeting with our negotiating partners, including China and Russia, to make the case for international sanctions. It took about 18 months. In June of 2010, we were able to get those sanctions passed by the Security Council. That's when the pressure began to build on the Iranians. And then I spent another good year traveling around, convincing countries to follow the sanctions. Because, if you're far, far away from the Middle East, if you're in Japan or South Korea and you're hungry for energy, you kind of say, well, what difference would it make if I buy a little oil or gas from Iran? And we had to be really tough and saying to our friends and our allies and others, it makes a big difference. We're trying to avoid a war, and we're trying to avoid Iran having a nuclear weapon, so you've got to work with us on this. And they did, and the pressure built. And then I began to put together the preliminary talks that led to the negotiations. And I think the President and Secretary Kerry and Secretary Moniz have done a great job. And so we've got this chance now I do think that we're in a very dangerous moment in the Middle East, as there often are. We have collapsing regimes like Assad in Syria. We have seen what has happened with Iraq. The Iraqis themselves really abandoned the opportunity they were given by the United States to have a military that was non-sectarian, that would include the Sunnis and the Kurds in a force that would protect Iraq. And instead, the prior Prime Minister, Maliki, began to eviscerate the military that the United States had trained. Now, I do think it's, a little bit surprising to hear Jeb Bush talk about this. He expects the American people to have a collective case of amnesia, and particularly the fact that George W. Bush signed the agreement with Maliki setting the withdrawal date of the end of 2011. Something else we inherited. And when we got there, and I know others tried, to make the case that the Iraqis could not go it alone yet, that they needed continuing intelligence help and surveillance and training support. Maliki wasn't interested, and he had the agreement signed by George W. Bush, and he just wanted the American troops gone so he could go about his merry business of undermining the country that he was supposed to lead. So I think the situation is is in many ways a very dangerous one because of the rise of ISIS, which largely took advantage of what was going on in Syria to conquer and hold territory and then to cross the border into Iraq. But I support what the president is doing now. We will help train. We will help provide air power. We will be there to back up Iraqi forces, Turkish assets to try to deal with ISIS, but we are not going to send American troops back to Iraq. So and finally, just let me quickly say, Putin and Russia, troubling. How many of you have seen the last season of House of Cards? I mean, he's a lot taller than Putin, but the actor playing him, based on my experience negotiating with and being with Putin, is right on the money. It's really quite remarkable. China's moves in the South China Sea are something we have to watch carefully, and their territorial demands vis-a-vis other countries, Vietnam, Japan, etc. North Korea remains always a threat because they have a nuclear weapons program, and they are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, not to our level of sophistication, but they're determined to get, to Hawaii if they can. So that is something we have to keep a close look on. A lot of the unrest and the conflict in Africa is in and of itself terrible because no people have in the last 20 years suffered more than Africans have from conflicts. 5.5 million people killed in Congo. And so we have a serious challenge to try to help resolve those conflicts and prevent terrorist groups from, taking hold in any of those areas like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or others. But on balance, we have a lot more opportunities than threats and dangers. And I think we need to be looking at how we are going to lead in the 21st century, leading with our values, leading with our interests, protecting our security and that of our allies, friends, and partners. And I would just close by saying, I went to 112 countries as your Secretary of State, and I came away with two overriding convictions. One, no matter what they say about us, most people wish they were here, not there. And so part of it is living up to our own ideals, making it absolutely clear we're going to continue to provide economic opportunity and equality and deal with our problems here at home, unlike places that just ignore them. We've got problems. Hopefully, we will tend to those problems, and that's been one of our great strengths. And then the other is the alternative to American leadership is not somebody else's leadership, it is nobody's. And that makes the world a very dangerous place. If you don't have the United States leading, whether it's feeding people, dealing with Ebola and other diseases, trying to move us forward against climate change, whatever the serious global issue might be, in the absence of American leadership, it will not get done. So I will be a president who will lead based on our best values and ideals, but I will lead our country for this century.